My silence.
We'll stop there. All right. Young Žižekians have assembled. We have a very special guest today, the inimitable Russell Sbriglia. Russell, how you feeling?
I'm feeling well. I'm very happy to be on with you guys. I like the work that you guys do quite a bit. And I think, this is one of the, if people actually want to know, Zizek well and correctly, I would say this is one of the places people should go. So.
Right, definitely. Because we're pretty much engaged with the text, the concepts, and how they apply. It's just sad but true that Zizek has just become a meme. And he's funny, right? And he doesn't give himself a place of mastery, but so many people on the internet are like, haha, Zizek eating hot dogs, this and hot dogs, that. But when it comes to actually engaging in the text, nobody knows Zizek, right? They only know him as ideology, but how does ideology function in his work?
Yeah, even you see when the takedown pieces come out, you would think that people who are professional academics would at least have read and attempted to understand him. But so I think even it spans the whole spectrum or the whole gamut, from somebody who hasn't read him at all, who's just interested, just wants to keep tweeting the him housing hot dogs, or right. Academics who presume to critique him when they really don't know what concepts or they haven't. I remember, this isn't true of the well, it is true of the Rock Hill piece, but I'm thinking of a piece from a few years ago, that current affairs piece, where it was all he does is talk about sex, but there was no engagement with what he means by sex. It was just oh, it's pervy because he's always talking about sex. And I was there was no nod to sex as ontological contradiction or anything like that. So right. I think just across the board, he's one of the most willfully misinterpreted or misread or underread thinkers.
Right.
So.
That's the same charge that's always been made about Freud, though. Me and Andrew always bring that up. Interesting thinker, just a little too obsessed with sex and his mother.
Yeah.
And it's ironically, it's Freud would have a field day with this, with all this new weird sexual kinks and people wanting to be called daddy or mommy. And it's just this ironic critical distance that they don't realize. But I think it's also funny with those charges of these recent articles, one, I think in the New York, the current affairs, and then Chomsky says this too, and then Rock Hill says this about oh, he's too hard to understand because he's got this obscure writing style, right? And then when you look at this article that just was published, you get so many leftists saying I'm dismissive of Zizek because the way he's writing so plain and simply, and he's using the term woke capitalism. Oh, that's so cringe. Or it's as if he's not allowed to say this or be in imminent dialogue with the common discourse that is being said in the mainstream or within the the political consciousness in general. It's very reminiscent of that one interview where he was talking about how when he wanted to publish a book for Verso, and they're oh no, we don't want you to do that because then you're gonna fill this book with a bunch of jokes and nobody's gonna take you seriously. And then he did the stuff with Lenin, the book on Lenin, and they're where are the jokes at? So it's the same. It's the same logic.
Yeah, be funny.
Yeah,
be funny. Tell a joke. You're in that situation where people are calling on you, telling you, make a joke. But I just wanted to put it out there. Yeah, the thing about the recent article, and we don't have to stay on this. Obviously, there's way more important stuff with theory that we can focus on. But with that recent article, though, we are being called transphobes for basically just saying, no, actually, he's raising a legitimate issue, concern, question. This is the medicalization of ego psychology and therapism, the industry, the commodification, and with it, this pipeline that involves misdiagnoses of children, in some cases, being harmed. That's real. And then they're oh, that's a right-wing talking point. Then you're right-wingers. Then you're transphobes. Then you're Nazis. And it's just we went from 0 to 80 really fast there. These are real issues. And besides Zizek taking this courageous stance, it's just being left to grifters like Tucker to capitalize on, so.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about the compact piece?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, we can, I mean, yeah, maybe we can talk about that later. But I think like this, you know, this happens. I do think now that it's like, it's different than, you know, 2 or 3 years ago or so, the current climate. So I worry about that. But I mean, there's, you know, then if you go in and read Sex and the Failed Absolute, or, you know, the theoretical texts, you know, he couldn't be clearer that, you know, he's an advocate for trans rights, and that, and maybe we can get into this a little bit with regard to subjectivity, is, you know, because he's consistent throughout his career in articulating that the marginalized position, and you could say that, well, if you're going to apply it to everybody or all different sort of like marginal categories across the board, then does it mean anything? But I would go in the opposite direction. So he'll say at various points, you know, depending upon the context, like, well, the black subjectivity, or the black subject, is sort of zero level subjectivity, or queer subjectivity, or trans subjectivity. And it's because of this, concrete universalism, right? You can only address the universal through the not necessarily the experience, but through a concrete subject position. And so I do think that at times he's not careful, but about like the language, just to go back to the previous point, I can't think of a philosopher who is easier to read with regard to language and sort of rhetoric. Like, now, if I open up to Tearing with the Negative, the concepts can be difficult because you're going through Hegel and Kant and Lacan, and so that can be challenging and can be, you know, opaque at times, and you know, recondite, any word, you know, $50 word you want to use to describe it. I wouldn't say obscurantist, but I think people who claim that his style is not clear. I mean, I told him this. I've told him this before. I've edited, you know, a lot of people's texts. Whenever he sends me something, like, it's always I have to do very little to it. Like, his writing is very clear. I find it very plain. So again, I think that's another way of kind of like avoiding actually engaging with him. I mean, I'm not saying people can't generally pick it up and be and have the experience of, oh, this style is difficult, but I don't, you know, I think he's like painfully clear compared to somebody like Derrida, for instance. So
yeah, there's I think one of the criticisms that Chomsky had of Slavoj and French theory in general, even though Slavoj is not French, but is in that tradition, it's like that they're too polysyllabic, I'm pretty sure was one of the words that he used. And it's like, well, if you're quoting German phrases, then, well, you can't avoid polysyllables.
Yeah,
but there are no monosyllabic words in German, as far as I know. I'm exaggerating.
That's like complaining that the verb is at the end of the sentence. It's like,
yeah,
what do you want me to do?
Exactly.
It's German.
But I wanted to build off something you were saying, because and I think you may have alluded to this in the conversation you had with Ben Burgess, where you were clarifying his point about Hegelian Marxism, that this subject position that in some sense is like the placeholder for the universal in the gamut of species there is distorted in the sense that it's confined to a specific perspective. But in Žižekian terms, that's almost an endorsement for it, wouldn't you say? And that for him, it's like, okay, what makes Marx so brilliant is that the proletarian is the subject of history at that point in time that can reveal the rift that is
right
the class division. So this is his idea of sexuality as well.
No, well, that's why he says class struggle is real, right? And real, like capital R, like Lacanian real, right? and I think it's the beginning. Is it the beginning of In Defense of Lost Causes? But where we, basically the two practices, sort of like truth practices in a way, would be psychoanalysis and Marxism. I mean, which is interesting for him that it's Marx there that he leads with and not Hegel, but it's the same thing, because the proletariat, in the same way that sort of the psychoanalytic notion of sex does, that's what brings you to the sort of the unsublatable kernel of antagonism, that, right, no matter how much mediation happens, there's never going to be a sort of an Aufhebung, in the sense of like overcoming, right? You come up against something that you can't overcome, and that would be the realization, like that would be absolute knowledge, right? Like the reconciling yourself. This is, I sound like Todd McGowan, but like reconciling yourself to the contradiction, which would also be why, that holds true of sex on the ontological level, but it's also true of capital, right? And why I think he prioritizes Hegel. One of the reasons why he prioritizes Hegel over Marx is because I was talking about this with Ben, is that he doesn't, like, the communist horizon for Slavoj is not, the dictatorship of the proletariat in the sense of overcoming all sorts of, or any kind of antagonism, that we just have this sort of utopia, right? So, which puts him in an interesting, Slavoj in an interesting position, vis-a-vis other leftist thinkers like Frederick Jameson, who's, written a lot about utopia. But no, I went off there a little bit, but no, totally. I mean, I forget, it's got to be in a couple books, but yeah, when he articulates, class struggle is real. This is the fundamental antagonism that, regardless of which sort of epoch you're in, it comes up, right? And so the proletariat, the sort of part of no part, that the sort of excremental remainder, you need that in order to access, universality. Yeah.
So to tie off of that, does that also play in with his notion of parallax view, in which if class struggle is real, and then we talk about the ontological status of sex, and like, I guess you could say the antinomies, that's real as well, then that's where he ties in Karatani's notion of the parallax to understand our subjectivity within this irreducible gap. And as you said, that point can't be sublated. So we're in this point to where we have to realize the contradiction via class struggle and the problem of subjectivity, which is the problem of sex, and how it pretty much what's happening in this parallax is that there's this that remainder is always, it's not being sublated, but retroactively it always comes back because it's trying to escape the pretty much the symbolic order, for lack of a better term, in how the labor and the worker is in extreme antagonism from surplus value and the capitalist itself, and they're in this deadlock, this Kantian antinomy, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with that, because one of the things that I think, well, I know that Slavoj shares with Lacan is that he comes up throughout his career. So a lot of people say that he just writes the same book over and over again. And from a certain perspective, like, that is true. I don't know if that's true, but he's interested in accessing the same kind of deadlock from multiple different angles. And so I think he gives these terms, or he comes up with different terms for this antagonism in different periods, right? So parallax, I think, is one of the most effective ways of describing it. And then, later he'll talk about, what does he talk about in, it's incontinence of the void. It's, the concept of the spandrel, right? There's another concept, like the disparity earlier, right? So he's coming up with these different terms in the same way that, Lacan will have, objet a, lamella, and you can get all kinds of, you can get hung up on, like, well, is this thing objet a, or is it lamella? Is it phallus? Like, and because Lacan was constantly revising it, right? I mean, they're never entirely different, but, or, a complete 180, but what objet petit a is in Seminar 4 is different from what it is in, Seminar 22, 23, right? It's changed, just as at the outset it wasn't object cause of desire in the way that he finally settled on that in the later Lacan. And so I think, yeah, Parallax is probably like, that's why I think Parallax View is one of the top 3-5 books of his, because you notice like the idea of spandrels from Incontinence of the Void, he hasn't really run with that much, but Parallax is one of the more effective ones that gets picked up with, or that people have picked up and run with. And of course, as you said, he takes it from Karatani. But I think that's absolutely right. I think that's sort of one of those instances where it's a different name for the kind of antagonism or contradiction that he keeps coming back to, right? That's irreconcilable, because in Parallax, those two points of view, like, I mean, it's another version of the antinomy, right? If you think about like Wittgenstein's duck rabbit, it's like it's never going to be a duck and a rabbit at the same at one and the same time, right? Something in your perspective has to shift in order for you to notice that. And of course, it's not the same thing, but you could tie that into something like anamorphosis, right? Where you're not going to see that object unless you're gazing, you're looking awry at it. So that's kind of what I like. That's one of the things that I like, is that these words are not, we're talking about, the obscurantist, or claims of obscurantism with jargon, but I think it's that they're quite clear what they're, if you study it and, try to trace it in earnest throughout these different books, that it's different formations of the same thing. And so I find it, pretty easy to grasp. But
Russ, would you also say like Parallax is another way of kind of talking about extimacy, in the sense of how, I mean, one of the big chapters in Parallax View is on neuroscience. And I mean, his great example is, we can't view ourselves as one, our phenomenological perceiving subjectivity, and the chunk of matter in our heads, our brains. Like it's like the duck rabbit. Like, yes, they are one and the same thing, but you have to totally shift your perspective. You can't just immediately go, me and my whole subjective history, my time on this earth that I've experienced, am this chunk of matter. It's like we can't make that connection. We can view things scientifically, and in that way, it's like, yeah, my brain is what I am. But when we view things psychoanalytically or phenomenologically, we can't make that connection. So, but the extimacy or the dialectical thing is trying to get how they are the same thing while being totally at odds with each other in various ways.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I think, to go back to the duck rabbit, like the visuals and the sort of like putting a sort of, topography to it, right? Like, so I'm thinking of the Mobius strip, right? I mean, it's not two-sided, it's one-sided, but because of that torsion, it appears as though it's two-sided, and the ant will never be on the ants crawling along it will only ever be on one side, but it appears as though it's two-sided, and those two sides will never coincide, because it's not two-sided. So it's kind of like it's kind of similar to the dynamic of the subject, because it's or maybe like human being with regard to the subject, because it's almost like more than one but not quite two. So no, I think extimacy is important there too, because you can have a moment where you get confronted by your own subjectivity, right? This is why I think Mladen Dolar, it's an old essay, but it's got the line from Frankenstein in it. I shall be with you on your wedding night, I think it's Lacan and the uncanny, and his argument there is essentially that what Lacan's term, extimate or extimacy is it basically is uncanniness, right? The sort of self outside of itself. So yeah, these are all, I think, terms within the sort of constellation that are inextricably linked in a way.
Let me ask you this, because I've always
Sure.
been curious about this.
Yeah.
So, and I've asked Todd this, and we had a discussion about it. And for me, it's still kind of a bit of an open question. I want to see if,
Yeah.
like, parallax and all this. Okay, The Ticklish Subject, one of his great books.
Uh-huh.
Nowhere in the book does he explain how the ticklish subject is ticklish. You have a theory of what that means here? Is it something to actually do with extimacy or parallax in some way?
Oh, that's a really good question. Boy.
You need to ask him that. Like, what's ticklish about the ticklish subject?
I don't. Boy, that's a really good question. I mean, this can't be right, but one of the articulations that I like about jouissance, or one of the examples that I like to use when I'm trying to teach it, is tickling, because it's a like you're laughing.
It ends with a tickle and ends in a blaze of patrol.
Right. Yeah, you see, yeah. It seems like you're enjoying it. It's beyond your, like, control. You don't want to do it. Like tickle torture is a good version of me.
That
Like,
makes sense.
yeah, but I don't think that's I would bet that that's not what he means by it. It's a great question. I really don't know.
Right. Well, it makes me think, if we're talking about the parallax and how he gets it from Karatani, going back to Kant, shows how that the thing in itself is not just this passive thing and we just can't know about it. And so we're just only dealing with the phenomenon. That's like, no, that there is this causality within a formal causality with the thing in itself. And therefore it actually stimulates us to move forward. And so therefore, this is an active object and us subjects are passive. And he says that, Zizek says that in the parallax chapter talking about Karatani and Kant. And that parallax object is going to be the objet petit a. And if we tie in that with jouissance, it makes sense if that is causing the tickle. But the difference between Kant and Zizek a la Hegel is that, well, as you were saying, the anamorphous, if we shift our perspective, we get to see a different aspect of it, because Kant only shows one side of that, the objective determination in the abstract form. But really what's shifting our perspective is the historical objective side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's making me think of the question now about what psychoanalysis and Zizek means by subject. And I almost think subject is itself a kind of tickle in a way, because and I'm trying to work this out now. I mean, of course there are many different subject positions even within Lacanian psychoanalysis, or there are different types, right? So there's somebody could be, you could have the hysteric, you could have somebody who's a pervert, right? I mean, even just as simple as masculine, feminine subject. But I'm not so much interested in that. I don't think that Sbriglia is so much interested in that as he is in trying to articulate a sort of zero level of subjectivity, sort of pure form of subjectivity. And I think that subjectivity is one way I would put it, and this doesn't answer Mikey your question, but I'm kind of just riffing here. But it's I almost think that the subject itself is that which is in excess of the entity that sort of spawns it, human being, that sort of tickles it, and is what renders sort of human being unable to sort of control itself in a way. And I think that this is one of the big problems that you come up against in trying to articulate a Lacanian psychoanalytic, or Zizek, even Hegelian notion of the subject, is that subject is well, first of all, subject has it can't have any positive being in the symbolic realm, right? That's why it's always a subject in the real. And subject is almost like this excessive emergence within a subject is almost like a parasite in a way, right? This sort of foreign alien kernel. That's why it's extimate, right? It's what's in. So Sbriglia says what's in the subject more than the subject. And I want to say it's subject is what's within human being more than human being. It's what exceeds human being. And so I'm just as guilty of it as other people, like using sometimes the term subject sort of loosely in the sense of meaning like person, even like phenomenological experience. And I just don't think that's it. I'm coming from, I come primarily from literary studies. And so I like examples from literature that sort of illustrate this. So I'm working on, it's taking longer than it should, but I'm working on an article now that's on Poe and subjectivity. And Slavoj has written about this a lot, not extendedly, but in a few different works of his. He'll talk about Poe's notion of perverseness, or the imp of the perverse. And one of them, if you remember this, I don't know if you're familiar with it comes up in two Poe stories. One is titled The Imp of the Perverse, and the other is titled The Black Cat. But an example, probably the most iconic example of this is, and Poe gives it, or the narrator gives it in The Imp of the Perverse, like you're standing on the edge of a precipice and you desire to look down, but if you look down, then basically this imp is going to materialize. And he says it's like a cloud, like a vapor that almost comes out of the bottle that the genie comes out of in Aladdin, almost like an evil genius in the Cartesian sense. And that it's this imp of the perverse that sort of pushes you over the edge, like it'll send you headlong. And so I think the standard way to understand that story would be that, oh, this is a subject who's plagued by this sort of entity, right? And I think like this subject there is imp of the perverse. Like that's the emergence of subjectivity. You have the sort of person or the self, and then the split is with the emergence of the subject. So I think even the phrase like split subjectivity or the split subject is kind of a misnomer, because I think subjectivity is that very split. And so I don't know if all sort of everyone in the Lacanian, universe, or of like the Lacanian orientation would necessarily agree with that. But I think, if you're following, Zizek's arguments, but it's there in Bruce Fink. He says the subject is kind of this being within the breach. It doesn't, it only exists. It's very ephemeral. One can't be a subject continuously. We would, that's why human being is, he says this in The Sublime Object, is the condition of human being is that of an animal sick unto death, right? Run off the rails with a thing. And that thing is the emergence of subjectivity, which is why subject is always connected to, Objektivität and das Ding, because what you're confronting is your own void, right?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up off of, this is a good segue into your response to Harman and his sort of like obtuse refusal to really get this concept of the subject, in that like he brings up the example, Lacan's famous example of the Sardine Can, right? As showing Lacan's what he considers to be sort of like a inherent kind of like Kantianism that Lacan may be disavowing, but it's actually like, I think in the essay he wrote, like he says a poor man's Kantianism,
realism.
Poor man's realism. So it's like, to me, it seems that there is a negligence of the distinction between subjectivity, consciousness, and the ego. Right now, Andrew and I are working through Seminar 2, and Seminar 2 is not the mature Lacan, of course, but there are a lot of ideas in there that I think would apply throughout the history of his system. And there's one of the lectures is it's called a materialist definition of the phenomenon of consciousness, and he uses this metaphor of the camera, and that the camera replicates consciousness without a subject, in a sense. So to explain just apperception, consciousness, you don't really you don't necessarily need a subject according to Lacan, and his efforts to like disambiguate subjectivity, the ego, which would be an object among other objects, but it's a virtual object, and then consciousness is important here. Whereas it seems to me that I guess it's Maya Su, right?
Yeah.
Who's I don't want to get them mixed up, but like they're obviously parallel takes there. But Maya Su's idea that like, oh well, this is just when Lacan sees this sardine can and identifies the subject as correlated to the object here, we're back at the Kantian origins of like transcendental apperception, and we haven't like surpassed it. But that's not what he's saying at all. It's that the object in this case has something to do with the subjectivity inscribed into it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I talk about that in the piece you just referenced, which is I actually, I like I'm friends with Graham Harman. He's a nice guy. But there's just sort of like there's an incommensurability there, and I don't think we're ever going to see eye to eye about this. But he wrote a somewhat mixed review. It wasn't really a review. It's an essay, a long essay on the subject lessons volume that Slavoj and I co-edited. And I was actually very thankful for him for doing that, even though he was critical of it. Maybe even more so because he was critical of certain pieces in it, because it drew more attention to it and gave it a bigger audience. But the piece you're talking about is my response to that, and he says it's in a number of different books. Yeah, he tries to use the Sardine Can from seminar 11, right? It's 11. And he basically says, like you were saying, that this is perpetuating, like we're still within the correlationist circle, because you have the subject, which he understands as the viewer, right? The phenomenological viewer who sees the sardine can, and you have the sardine can looking back at that person, right? As objet petit a. And Harman's argument is that he talks about, Merleau-Ponty too. He says it's basically a version of Merleau-Ponty where the world looks back at us just as we look at it. And he says that doesn't get you far enough out of this, ontotaxonomy where 50% of ontology is human being and the other 50, like the rest of the world is the other 50%, right? But my point there is that this is not this scene is not a dyadic scene where subject is the viewer, right? This is what, like, you could just think of the formula for fantasy, right? The barred subject with the lozenge, right, and then objet a. It's that subject is like the objet a is that subject, because the objet a is nothing but, right, it's the object cause of the subject's desire,
right?
And so you're not seeing, it's not that an object is looking at a subject. It's that when that object is looking at the subject, it's the human being being confronted with his or her subjectivity, like looking back at them, right? That's the whole point of Lacan's notion of the gaze. It has nothing to do with the view, and Mulvey and everyone took it in a completely different direction, that especially with regard to like the male gaze, right? That it's this sort of scopophilia. No, the gaze is when the visual field looks back at you and sort of calls you into question or interpolates you. I mean, Todd's written on, hundreds of pages on this and can articulate it much better than I do. But so that's just one illustration of when say somebody who's, and Harman he's not, he's a rare sort of, professional American continental philosopher as opposed to an analytic philosopher, but nonetheless, his notion of subject there, or what he means by the term subject, is a very standard philosophical, analytical one, where it just means, the viewer or the ego or the self or the I. And of course, that's why Lacan always, like, that subject is always subject of the unconscious.
Right.
So there's a lot of misunderstandings here, and you could disagree with that, or and say that, okay, well, that's that you could dismiss that notion of subjectivity, but let's at least come to terms with what's being discussed here, or what the entity known as subject, or that psychoanalysis refers to as subject, is. It's not the person seeing something and then the object looking back at you, right?
Right.
Subject is nothing but that excremental object, right?
That's interesting. And do you think like Grant Harman also negates or isn't realize he doesn't realize the fact that, like, as you said, it's not just this one-to-one of like a viewer seeing an object, but with the gaze of objectivity, in, for instance, the example of Sardine Can, it puts into question not only the subject, but the symbolic position that allows the subject to view, or the framework which allows it to see the object. And this is where like Zizek talks about in the first chapter on the one, and for they know not what they do. It's like this imaginary and symbolic are not this like external entities that are just like in conflict, rather that the symbolic order is birthed within the focal point of the imaginary, in which there's this double reflection. So it's not that there's this viewer that is just seeing the Sardine Can, but rather a vantage point that's virtual that allows me to have a framework to see the objects.
Right. I mean, that's why because the real, and you could see why. I mean, I hope this isn't like too far afield, but you can see why, especially some of the earlier Deleuze, like there is some connection there, because the real, like the subject is a virtual, it's a virtual entity itself. That was why I was saying earlier, it's like subjectivity, like true subjectivity is ephemeral, and it's fleeting. You can't stay in a certain mode of subjectivity. That's why, for Lacan, he speaks about, acts, right? You can only maintain that for a certain amount before it becomes unbearable. And so I think that's absolutely right. And wait, but I lost my train of thought. I was going to say something else, and it'll come back to me.
It had to do with my question about
it had to do with, wait, can you just what were you, can you make the point? Sorry.
Pretty much I was saying, like, do you think like with Grant Harman's kind of critique of Lacan's understanding of the subject and the example of the gaze of the Sardine Can, like he doesn't realize that it's not this one-to-one ratio, but what's really going on is that there is there's a virtual point.
There's a virtual
the subject takes itself into account.
No, that I think is completely right. And I think that the sort of virtual nature, that's what it was, the virtual that sent me down the Deleuze thing, which I never should have done. But no, I think that's right. And I also think that, it's interesting that, and a lot of it is sort of on the wane. Like 4 or 5 years ago, like object-oriented ontology, new materialism, all these things, it was everywhere. And it was so funny to me that that the very thing that they're against, so the Cartesian subject, it's like they hadn't read any or absorbed any psychoanalysis, because the answer is kind of it's right there already. And so I think that this notion, again, of tying subjectivity, like we need to be very clear on what we mean when we say subject, because it's not entirely clear to me that stepping out of the, like you'll hear thinkers like what's her name, Jane Bennett, and Levi Bryant, about like stepping out of the human subject. Okay, like I do agree, like it'd be good to sort of step outside of of like this sort of anthropocentric focus for the purposes of the environment and other things, but that's not subjectivity. In fact, if you want to sort of solve these problems, you need like radical subjectivation, right? Yeah. So, but I agree with that point. Like the virtual is a huge, it's a central element there.
I just want to add, because it's like the kind of surpassing of this like notion of this anthropocentric view of the world had already been achieved in a sense in Freud's kind of Copernican shift there, because that already represents a fundamental decentering of the subject. It just doesn't have this kind of like almost self-flagellating quality that people look for when it's like, oh, we need to just realize that we're just part of nature and we're just one among many different living organisms.
Yeah. It doesn't have the it doesn't have the sort of moralism tied to it in the same way. I mean, it's related to morality, right? I mean, Freud's basic, like, man is not only, more immoral, but what's the line now? Man is not only more moral than I'm going to forget it now. There's the moral and immoral line in Freud.
Like, I think it's like man is more moral than he thinks, but also more immoral than he can imagine.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. But it doesn't have, but it doesn't have the sort of, moralistic element to it where, if you don't divest from that, you're, a bad person for ecos, you're a champion of ecocide or something like that. Yeah.
I think that on the side of the sublation media folks like Douglas Lane and Ashley Frowley, who I was supposed to talk to her today, but she had something, she's not feeling well, so she's in recovery. We wish you well, Ashley. But because they're coming from like this Foucauldian, or at least she's coming from like this more Foucauldian vein, I think subject for her means something very different. And so when she'll say things like, the left is so stuck in this subject thing and this symbolic stuff, and she'll literally say that, but what she's getting at is like the performativity, the virtue signaling, the thinking about everything from the subjective standpoint and not thinking about things from a material basis, right? And so, and maybe we could use this as a little point to clarify what we do mean by subject, and by how that kind of symbolic performativity has less to do with what we're talking about when we're talking about the symbolic in terms of Lacanian theory.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting because, like, I mean, for Foucault, I mean, there's the later Foucault where he takes a kind of like proto neoliberal turn, but in Foucault, they're kind of, and it's similar for Althusser in a certain way. There is no sort of escape for the I mean, to be subject is entirely to be a sort of epiphenomenon or byproduct of discourse, right? But for Lacan, and then for Slava, and I think this is why he's so insistent upon this subject, because that's where freedom lies in subjectivity. Now it's not, it's he liked that line, he likes it, freedom hurts. It's not freedom to do whatever you want, or to be hedonistic, but the fact that interpolation doesn't always work, right? Like misrecognition is sort of key to subjectivity for Zizek. And so I think that like, that's why, and I think that there's I think like Foucault's, I'm not a Foucauldian, and I have issues with Foucault, but I think there's a lot in Foucault that we could learn from, and that's valuable. But I think that you can, the irony to me always of people who champion Foucault is that I think you're almost left in, like, theoretically you come you're left in a sort of prison, ironically, that subjectivity can't get out of, where I think that the whole notion of subject is that it's in excess of it's related to, because right, if the subject, if the Žižekian or Lacanian subject is subject in the real, it's always going to be in excess, even though it's sort of the byproduct or remainder of the process of symbolization. It's always going to resist being dominated or falling within that sort of symbolic network, because it's beyond the symbolic, right? Whereas I think there I could be wrong. I haven't gone back and studied Foucault closely in a while, but there's not a notion of the real there, because everything is sort of like historically contingent, right? This would be the more historicist element. There's a reason why in like literary and cultural studies, this is ancient, but new historicism came out of Foucault, right? This is why, Slavoj will say, if you were to ask Foucault or a Foucauldian if there's such a thing as human nature, you would have to, couch it in, well, what do we mean by human nature? But in a certain epoch, under certain conditions, right? There is no sort of universal notion of something like a real. And of course, a real articulates itself differently under different historical, socio-symbolic constellations. But that, to go back to what we were talking about way at the beginning, that's the sort of hard kernel that you can't, get over, that you're always going to encounter. So it's interesting to me, because from a Foucauldian perspective, I think like the notion of subjectivity is almost always a trap. So like you set up this trap for yourself to then try to liberate yourself from, but I don't see a way out of it within that domain. Whereas the failure of interpolation, the fact that subject is what escapes, the symbolic, the sort of deadlock of formalization or symbolization, like that's its emancipatory potential, right? And so I just think that like there are entirely different theories of what would count as emancipation, right? Because like the subject, this is ethics of psychoanalysis now, right? And you guys can stop me if I'm just going too far afield now, but
this is great.
The ethics of psychoanalysis has nothing to do with like pursuing the good up to and including one's own good, right? This is why Lacan says, he articulates it differently at a few points. I think it's Seminar 7, right? Like jouissance is evil. Like you pursue it, but you pursue it and you're willing to sacrifice your own being and the being of others. That's why it's kind of this insatiable. I think this is actually a line I was reading back through. Which book is it? I was just jumping sort of back and forth to find a line in one of Slavoj's books, but he basically says like subject like it's an insatiable parasite, right? But Dave, I don't know if that now I'm forgetting where your question started, but that's the Foucault, like somebody who uses the term subject from a Foucauldian perspective. That's how I tend to think about it. But
I think that's really good. And I wonder, Mikey, I know you've got a bunch of questions that we'll probably never get to, but do you have any that you think might be a good tie-in right here as far as?
I just think I think part of the issue that we have, as all of us being Lacanian and Žižekians in a way, when it comes to talking to Foucauldians or them people in more of the traditional kind of post-war French mindset, right? I honestly, I think Todd has done a lot to clarify this. When they say subject, they're primarily referring to symbolic identity. Yeah. When we say subject, we're talking about this real remainder that falls out of symbolic identity and cannot be reduced to it. And for Foucault, for Althusser, so last night, Russ, we had our first thing on For They Know Not What They Do. Yeah. And in the introduction, Slavoj mentions logical time. And so I did this thing where I tried to break down the basics of Lacan's essay. And part of it is this idea that a symbolic subject is somebody who's caught up in a kind of network of logic that whether it's the odds and evens game he also talks about with the coin flips, that a symbolic matrix generates all kinds of possibilities and impossibilities within itself. And for Foucault and for Althusser and for anybody in like the pure kind of structuralist mindset, we're just cogs in this machine. We are symbolic puppets in this way because the symbolic order has its own logic. It establishes what counts as objective variables within itself, and everything's just a symbolic machine or automaton, like Lacan talks about in Seminar 11. Yeah. And the problem for us is that no, something else is going on. Something falls out of this, and it prevents us from being pure symbolic puppets, which again, we can never fully identify with our symbolic identities. And so we can, with Althusser or Foucault, at least at maybe a certain point in his career, or like Levi-Strauss, right? We're talking about a kind of structuralist determinism. And what Lacan and what Žižek are doing is say there is truth to that. We are caught up in these symbolic systems, but there's this thing that falls out or remains that is irreducible to our symbolic identities, and that thing that isn't irreducible is identity. Now, when I try to talk about this with people who are into different areas of philosophy, if it's going to click for them, you kind of have, I'm finding I have to reword it in some way. And so, like in a basic way, when you take a young child who's still pre-linguistic, they haven't assimilated language, they are a consciousness. And then as they start to assimilate language, they're starting to realize, oh, these two authority figure or one authority figure, the big other, whoever is embodying the big other, is telling me I'm X, Y, and Z. So now I have to come to identify with that. But the point is, consciousness itself is not these things. And this is why this, méconnaissance, this misrecognition is so core to us, both in an imaginary way, as far as I can perceive my hands, right? And so in some sense, I know that they're connected to me, but I'm also, as a subject or as a consciousness, I'm also not these. Like I am, but I'm not. But then when you get into, so there's the whole thing with the imaginary and the body and imago and all that with the mirror stage. But then when it comes to the symbolic, you're told you occupy this position, that position, you are this, you know, and the point is consciousness is not identical to these signifiers and to these images. And so what falls out is consciousness has to identify with things that it's not. And what falls out of it is this virtual subject that is purely empty, because what it is, it's almost like the subject is the full embodiment of, and it's funny, I say empty, but embodied. Well, it's Mobius thing, right? It is this, I'm not these things. And that's why when we talk about subjective destitution or the empty subject, it's a pure empty negative subject, because it is its inability to be these positive characteristics that it's told to identify with.
Yeah. Now that's way better than I could have put it. I totally agree with that. I mean, that's exactly right. And I think that, you know, it's not as though like, you know, subjectivity is it's not as though there's not a sort of, I don't know if determinism is the right term to use here, but it's not as though, like, in the framework that we're working with, that there isn't some sort of notion of determinism. There's something very dialectical going on with the psychoanalytic notion of freedom, right? And this, Slavoj's been talking about this more recently, but it goes all the way back to Sublime Object of Ideology. I think it's Which Subject of the Real, that chapter, where he talks about the forced choice, right? And the unconscious choice of the subject. So it's not as though, like, you know, freedom is being cast as, again, like, I can choose, you know, well, I can choose to do whatever I want. Freedom is, like, paradoxically this kind of fidelity to a choice that, you know, you've already, that's already made for you, which is why it can almost seem like fate. Mladen Dolar has this great essay called is it in the first, I think it's in the it's in one of those Duke collections, the same series that my Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Literature but Were Afraid to Ask Zizek book is in. I think it's the first one, Gaze and Voice as love objects. And Mladen has this piece called At First Sight, and it's about the trope of falling in love at first sight in literature, and how you're like that's like the sort of the birth of subjectivity and of freedom is actually when you feel sort of least free, because again, it's like you can't feel as though, or Slavoj talks about this, you feel as though you can't help but do anything else but to make this sort of choice, and that choice is often a choice that is detrimental to you personally, or to, at least to your interest, like sort of, I don't know, from the utilitarian perspective, right? So there is, Mikey, to go back to like what you were talking about with you can see, I mean, Lacan himself is he's more of a structuralist than a post-structuralist, right? Like post-structuralism, I think, is entirely wrong. I think Slava was right to point out that, to stress early on that Lacan is not a post-structuralist and is not to be lumped in with all these other people. But I think that the way in which like Lacan sort of takes a notion like freedom and it's always kind of has this dialectical weight to it, which is why Slavoj says, Lacan is often the most Hegelian when he doesn't realize it, right? The psychoanalytic notion of like the act or freedom, it's there is, I mean, drive, right? Repetition, compulsion. There's a sense of not being in control, but that's also the way in which you can avoid sort of being locked into this sort of socio-symbolic matrix. But that's also why, the question, like the issue of hysteria, right? Or why the subject is always hysterical. Why am I what you're telling me that I am, right? That's the sort of hysterical question that the subject asks. And so the notion that you were saying, Mikey, that like subject is what falls out, what what consciousness can't identify with because it's not it. That's an excellent way of articulating the negative nature of subjectivity. That subjectivity is this very negativity.
And that's right. The whole reason all of us as neurotics, whether hysterical or obsessional, we're all driven by that hysterical question of why am I what you're telling me? And the point is, it's like negative theology in a sense. Like when we talk about subjectivity, it's negative subjectivity in the sense that we're always challenging or questioning our symbolic identity, imaginary symbolic coordinates, as we also call them, because we're not fully them. And since we're not fully them, we always, in a weird way, we feel some kind of alienation in being our positive identities.
Yes.
And there's something that eats away at us going, I'm not this. That's not, I don't know what I am, but I know I'm not fully this. And that split that's the split of subjectivity, and it's freedom. It's not freedom in the liberal sense of free will and I choose everything knowingly and rationally. It's freedom from being fully identical to your imaginary symbolic coordinates. And
this is why
you can get out of them in a way. But you're always going to have them, but you can go into other ones.
Yeah, no, sorry to jump in. I was thinking, this makes me think of the gallows apologue in Kant in the second critique, because and I like how Lacan, when he talks about this in Kant with Sade, right? It's the scenario where Kant says, somebody who follows a maxim regardless, and then you erect a gallows and you tell that person that if they are to actually go through with it and go into the brothel or whatever it is, that the gallows is waiting for them. And Lacan has this line like, well, Kant then answers this, we don't have to wait long for what the answer is. And for Kant, it's inconceivable that one would follow through with that and practice the maxim, because you wouldn't follow it to death. Whereas Lacan's whole point is like, I'm forgetting the exact quip that he has too. He's like sort of like a hat carrying bourgeois or something. But the whole point there would be that the freedom lies entirely in actually like succumbing to that. Like in actually gratifying it, because there you're disidentifying with, the good bourgeois that you're supposed to be, who's concerned above all with, maintaining one's own life, right? And it's kind of like a different version of not to go into a gamba, but it's kind of like a different version of bare life. Like, it's like, oh, if I can't, go into this brothel and fuck a prostitute, like I might as well be dead, because that's my. Now, again, that's not to say that you can reduce psychoanalysis to, again, like the a hedonist injunction to enjoy, but the whole problem is you can't kind of escape from it, right? This is what Slavoj is talking about later in that compact piece about superego. It's like you're never going to be able to satisfy the superego, because the more you try to fulfill its commands, the guiltier you are, right?
I wanted to build off of what you've been saying about freedom, which is great, and maybe we could tie it in with what Alenka Zupancic talks about a lot in her work, which is freedom and causality, and the Lacanian notion of causality, which is not necessarily the causality that we associate with science, which would just be a series of effects. And one of those effects is misrecognized as the cause of this chain of effects. Whereas for Lacan, we have the signifying chain, and we have something that, let's say, malfunctions in the signifying chain, but then sort of retroactively appears to be, the reason for what set the chain in motion, in a sense. And then from that, we get this psychoanalytic notion of freedom as it relates to this kind of causality. And then there's something which Zupancic calls, and it's also the title of her book, The Ethics of the Real. But how do you think that we can assume that place of the real, bearing all of this in mind in an ethical sense? What's the exact stance here?
The stance with regard to, so that what's the ethical stance?
What would be, I don't know, an example of actualizing this sort of freedom when we're taking into account what Lacan means by the symbolic order, and the real as that which, goes wrong in the symbolic order?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I like, Lacan's answer would be, Antigone would be a good example, right? Because it's not, and actually this makes me, I thought of that because Alenka has this new book out on Antigone called Let Them Rot in Antigone's Parallax. But, she says there's all these readings where it has to do about, like, the good, and Antigone is not interested in upholding the good. She's maintained sort of fidelity to the cause of her brother. But I'm trying to think of a good way to answer your question. Maybe I can approach it through, or if any of you guys have a better answer. I'm thinking of retroactivity. But yeah.
I was gonna ask, not necessarily an answer, but maybe it tied into something else. What's the relationship between this notion of freedom, and not just like Lacan and Zizek, but also with the notion of Bartleby politics of I would prefer not to? Like, does that tie in with this notion of freedom that's different from, like, the free will and compatibilism in analytical philosophy?
Yeah,
Russ,
I mean,
I know you
yeah.
have, like, that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about. You have a critique of Zizek's reading of Bartleby, right?
Yeah. I don't think that Bartleby is the subject in that, or is the best figure of the subject in that story. I think the figure of the subject in that story is actually the narrator, like the lawyer, because, like, for me, what that story details, and like, I see why it became like a sort of anti-capitalist, talk, something that, Occupy, the Occupy movement latched onto. But I don't see, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, I don't see a straightforward like critique of capital so much in that, although it is in a lot of Melville. But I think like the problem, Bartleby is kind of this sort of cipher to me. And I think like Bartleby having a preference, like I see where Slavoj is going with this, because in sort of like preferring not to, right, he's, he says it's a politics of subtraction. He says like he steps outside of the system. But I don't, like, I want to say that's not, that Bartleby is not necessarily a good version of political subjectivity, because I don't know if like wasting away in like the prison at the tombs like he does at the end is good. So my focus in that story is like, because Bartleby is so inscrutable, that he's confronting the narrator, like the lawyer / narrator. Like Bartleby is kind of like the cave void there. It's like, I don't know what you want from me. I don't know what to do. And I think he literally hystericizes that narrator. I think the narrator is like the most sublime hysteric, right? At one point, the narrator, rather than actually like, kick Bartleby out. I'm not saying that that's necessarily what he should have done, but he decides to move. Like he just moves his own office. And it's like, and so I think like it, more than anything, that story to me sort of indicates a sort of the hysterical notion of subjectivity. So I don't, that's like one of the few things that I like sort of disagree with. I mean, I see where he's coming from, but where I disagree with Slavoj there. But I'm still trying to think about this. I don't know if I have a good answer to the previous question.
Russ,
what I would say is that
the ethics of psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
This is part of what I Slavoj has this great quote, and it's, God, where's it from? I always want to say it's in How to Read Lacan, but then it's not that. I can find the quote. But the point is, at one point he goes, look, this idea that the ethics of psychoanalysis is a kind of, a refusal to give ground relative to your desire, which is to say simply, I am not compromising my desire. I'm going for it. I'm staying faithful to it. I'm acting on it regardless of the consequences. Slavoj points out, like, yeah, but here's the issue. Desire is always compromise. It's the desire of the other. It's being, you always desire something else. It's the metonymic sliding of desire. And he goes, the ethics of psychoanalysis is not the ethics of desire. It's the ethics of drive. It's this persistent thing in us that we have to have, even if it means our self-destruction. And that's what the ethics of psychoanalysis would have to, for him at least, what we're remaining faithful to. And so that's what Antigone does. Like, her drive is caught up with, you're going to give my brother a fucking proper burial, and I don't give a shit what the consequences are. I'm remaining faithful to my drive in that way. Oh wait, you got muted.
Oh, you're muted.
Yep, you're muted.
Sorry. I don't know what app. I had the Vine. That really helps me a lot, because it's deontological, but with a twist, like in like Kant, right? So Kant, because anything like sensuous, right, in Kant is to be rejected as it's not rational, it's not a grounds of the ethical, right? And so desire for him, probably because it's embodied for him, right? Desire would be pathological, right? And so to follow your desire cannot be ethical for Kant, because it's like desire does not belong to the realm of rationality, right? But for Lacan, right, though, this is where the idea of pure desire comes in. I think Slavoj says this at one point in his reading of Kant with Sade, is that what Lacan articulates there is a sort of ethics of pure desire. And actually, I think like the proper term for that would almost be ethics of the drive, like because desire, like drive is always going to trump desire, because desire is kind of the lure. Desire is kind of what drive uses to sort of continue the repetition, right? Because desire has a goal. Drive has no goal other than to just keep repeating the lack, right? That's the whole point of repetition compulsion. And so that's exactly right with Antigone, is like utterly heedless of all consequences, to follow it out. And I'm thinking, well, this is also why I don't like the ethics of the real is always a kind of sublime, monstrous ethics in a way, because we don't know if we're making the right choice. There is no guarantee. This is why Alenka Zupancic talks about this, but Slavoj also talks about it. Why the moral law is sort of and I think this is true in both a Lacanian and a Kantian sense. I think this is why Lacan says, I mentioned earlier, like jouissance is evil, because the categorical imperative is it's contentless, right? It's just this empty formalism, and it's just do your duty. But if we knew what our duty was, then we wouldn't be free. Like that's where, right, we would be God. And so, you couldn't act ethically if you knew what the right thing to do was. So part of it is like, that's what's so terrifying. And this is where the ethics of psychoanalysis comes in. The ethics of the real, like it can always be kind of indistinguishable from diabolical evil, right? So to follow your desire can both end up furthering the highest good, but also sort of pure evil in a way. And this is the anxiety of freedom, right? Is that, how do I know that when I'm acting in accordance with a universal maxim that is good? But in Lacan, like the good just falls out entirely, right? It's maintaining that fidelity, not just to desire, but to a pure desire, which would be drive. So Mike, you helped me you helped me to get there.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, and part of it is the basic criticism, and I think this is obviously warranted when we're talking like this. Somebody could easily go, okay, so if we boil it down to the point, the main point, like if psychoanalysis is there to help us in some way get to live the ethics of our drive, right? Part of it is, well, what if our drive wants us is moving towards us doing something diabolically evil? So somebody could easily throw out, well, what about a serial killer, right? So is Lacan going to actually say, well, you should pursue your drive,
right?
And the thing is, of course, Lacan doesn't want a serial killer running wild. Within the clinic, what a psychoanalyst is dealing with is this issue. The issue is this: I'm always having to make compromises in being a member of society, because I'm not really tapped in. I'm not living in accordance with my fundamental jouissance or drive. I'm holding back. I'm always going to have guilt. And this is not even super egoic guilt. This is something almost like deeper, where it's like I'm always compromising myself. And this can eat away at us. And except in extreme situations like the serial killer, most of the time, the drive people have, even if it would mean destroying their social status or something like that, if you live a life where you're constantly compromising to live according to the norms of your society or whatever, you're going to feel guilty about that. And part of it is trying to help a subject work through, on the one hand, there are social morals you're supposed to live by, but on the other hand, you're constantly plagued by this urge to live according to your jouissance and to not compromise, and you're caught in this conflict. And so psychoanalysis in some way can just be said to be trying to help us work through the ethics of our drive in that way.
No, I think that's totally right. Because look, if the ethics of psychoanalysis, to go back to like, the serial killer, which is a great example, if the ethics of psychoanalysis were merely to just follow, your desire regardless of what it is or regardless of your consequences, we wouldn't need it. The whole point that Slavoj makes again and again is that, like, that this is what our culture is already telling us, is we're being bombarded with the imperative to enjoy, right? So that, if you just think of campaign slogans like "just do it," you do you, like we're always being told that the best thing that you could do to achieve yourself is to follow your desire. So again, if psychoanalysis were merely just as simple as, do what you want, we wouldn't need it. Like, that's exactly what we're hearing from all corners. So I did find a passage I was just looking for, because I was working on this the other day. I'm not going to read a lot of it. It'll probably be boring, but there's a great point, a great section in it's in Indivisible Remainder. It's toward the end of it. And it's the section is called Desire is Desire of the Other. And he goes through, here are the different forms of ethics in Lacan. He gives you the imaginary, ethics of the imaginary, the ethics of the symbolic, which is the ethics of, the word. And then there's ethics of the real. And he ends that, it's multiple pages, it's like 5 or 6 pages. But he ends this by saying, I just think this is so useful. Isn't Kant the most sublime of all sadists? But he says what Lacan has in mind is actually the exact opposite of this thesis of the sadistic character of Kantian ethics, right? That basically, Freud basically says this, right? Like that the superego is essentially kind of this Kantian imperative. But Lacan's aim is not to besmirch the purity of the Kantian imperative, to discern beneath it the pathological sadistic enjoyment, but on the contrary, to demonstrate the Sadian will to enjoy, so jouissance, is thoroughly pure ethical in the strictest Kantian sense. The Sadian will, the sadist will to enjoy, is an exemplary case of a pure, non-pathological desire. So there is this sort of, to go back to like this sort of like monstrous, maybe like sadist is another, term to describe it, but it's not in the sense of like the serial killer who gets enjoyment from, killing other people, right? The whole point of the ethics of psychoanalysis is, like, as you were saying, like, well, I can't say it better than you said it, but yeah, it's not this sort of simplistic, just follow your desire to the end, because as you say, we're always compromising. But like the ethics of it's an ethics of the real. It's because you've come upon the one thing that like subjectivity will not compromise on, and that's why subjectivity is tied to death drive, because it doesn't care for your rules of society, or what society tells you is in your best interest, or self-preservation, right? That's what's so funny is like liberal political theory, whether it's utilitarianism, whether it's Locke, it's all about self-preservation. I think even in Locke it's like, well, because God gave you your life, you have to preserve it. It couldn't be further from psychoanalysis, right?
Well, no, and what you're saying is that this type of jouissance, this drive we have, it's the substance of our being. Now, being, okay, maybe we'll cross out being here because we're splitting subjects.
Yeah.
But it's, Todd also is good on this, where you mentioned Agamben in Bare Life, but Todd and also Alenka in, I believe it's Why Psychoanalysis, we're only alive so long as we have this surplus life. And the surplus life is this excessive enjoyment. And all of our various forms of enjoyment, all 5 of us, if anybody was watching us, which is like this horrifying thought, but if somebody saw the most intimate details of we all five enjoy ourselves differently. But these very idiosyncratic forms of excessive enjoyment, they're what fuel us. They're what keep us going. And so even if they're not accepted by the norms of society, even if they're disgusting, even if they're harmful, there's some part, like us as individual subjects need these in order to be alive at all. We have to have these forms of surplus in order to be alive libidinally. And so that's the thing, like, because we're not capable of just living a bare life. That's what's so terrible about what Agamben describes as bare life, because what bare life is non-life. It's, for us, it's life deprived of us, of our surplus. And so no, and then as far as the ethics of psychoanalysis go, the other side of it is, because our social ethic is superegoic, it's the duty to enjoy, which Lacan doesn't really say this until seminar 20. So back in seminar 7, he's not operating with this capitalistic consumer logic of enjoyment. And so part of what psychoanalysis would do now in trying to facilitate the ethics of psychoanalysis is you don't have to enjoy. And part of the fidelity to your own drive would be, I don't have to enjoy the way the superego is trying to get me to enjoy. It's freedom from that. And my enjoyment doesn't have to be in the image of the superego. And in that sense, I'm free to enjoy or not enjoy, but I don't have to be shackled to the injunction of the superego's enjoy. So yeah.
No, that's entirely correct. That's why it's a kind of like unplugging almost. I think that's almost why Slavoj likes the example of Bartleby, because he prefers his enjoyment is preferring not to. Like that's a kind of, and it's an enjoyment. It's literally an enjoyment unto death, because he just wastes away until, but yeah. And so that's what's so radical about the ethics of psychoanalysis. Right. But again, it's like, if you can misinterpret that as just following your enjoyment, whereas you're saying the thing, the radical move here would be not to enjoy, right? To step outside of that, because there's a way in which, because the subject is tied to jouissance and to drive, that one would be tempted to say, well, then psychoanalysis is just self-destructive entirely, because you're just following it to but it's not about that. It is about our, like, not compromising on your drive, but that doesn't mean, again, like, just doing whatever you want. It would be a pure, hedonistic, it would be just new age obscurantism, basically,
or transgression, pretty much. Like that's all you would be left with. Yeah. Because if you don't have this like aspect of the ethics of the real or drive that could align with something that's an alternative, all you're left with is maintaining the symbolic order with this injunction to enjoy, which you get enjoyment from transgression. Since if we're talking about seminar 11, jouissance has that transgressive element, right? And so what more to maintain the law than by constantly needing to transgress it just to validate it more.
Right. Well, that's why enjoyment is the obscene underside of the law, right? That's why you can't have, like, right. So in order to enter the symbolic, you have to give up your enjoyment, right? You have to renounce enjoyment, because I mean, if we're being like, the most basic, right? The no of the father, like I'm thinking of, like, nom du père and nom du, like the pun on that, right? The homophony on the no and the name of the father, right? To enter the right. So there is a sort of symbolic subject, but it's always the barred subject, right? Because then you have the subject of the real, which is subject. But the father's prohibition is always, I'm working on this now in Melville. The father's no is always, the underside of it is always to enjoy. Like the underside, like there's the symbolic father, which is the name of the father, and then there's père jouissant, there's father of enjoyment, right? And those two are always, that's always the obscene underside of the law. So following there's always transgression built into it. And we're back to something we were, talking about earlier.
Isn't it like the name of the father also names the desire of the mother, in that like what was just this amorphous, lawless sort of I don't know what to call it exactly, but like pre-paternal imaginary like submersion then becomes what it always was in a sense. So it's like it's not even an incestuous desire until the law intervenes.
Right. It doesn't. Right. This is the whole point. This is retroactivity, Nachtraglichkeit, right? Like it's that, and this is why the unity, it's always a sort of chimera, because it only exists as lost, right? We didn't really have the unity is itself a sort of retroactively generated fiction, right? That's why we think that to keep pursuing different like objets petit, like one of them will be it sometime. Like, okay, I pursued that object that I elevated to the dignity of the thing, or like the missing piece that if I had it, I'll be full, and then I get it, and it's never it, regardless of if it's a person, like, I don't know, a commodity, whatever. We're constantly sort of disappointed by that. But that unity, right, the cut, like the unity is created by the cut, right? That's the sort of irony of it. So that the desire to go back to this sort of like, Edenic relationship where we were whole, right, is always a fiction generated after the fact. That's why the temporality of the real is both before and it's like pre and post symbolic, right? And that's why causation is so tricky, because in some ways, I forget which book this is in, it might be multiple ones, right? The subject is its own cause, right? The subject causes itself in this sort of this, I don't know if temporal loop is the right thing, but that's why when I was talking about freedom and fate earlier, and Mladen Dolar is very good on this in his piece At First Sight. But the most contingent experience, like seeing the face of another person and falling in love immediately, it's the same thing with freedom and fate. Contingency and necessity are always sort of dialectically interlinked there, and so you can't. It's simultaneously the subject's greatest freedom, but you feel as though you've been struck by Cupid's arrow, and you feel as though you're in the position of a slave, even though that is your subjectivity, which goes back like earlier to this point we made about contrary to the way that a lot of theorists and philosophers use the term subject now. Subjectivity is a gesture of passivity that Slavoj says it in many places. I'm thinking of that it's in Less Than Nothing. It's also in the I think it's either his preface or his foreword or his afterword to this collection, Hegel and the Infinite. And it's like, I think the piece is called Hegel and Shitting, or something. He says, the apogee is when the subject lets something go. The subject is thoroughly passive, not a mega actant that's positing, all of reality in this sort of caricature of what, a Kantian or, an idealist subject is, right?
I've been sitting here and all of this. I kind of just want to say this because it goes back, because this passivity thing and how it connects the subject, and like the ethics of psychoanalysis in a way is not, even though we talk about the act, we even use that term, it's a kind of fidelity to something you're not actively controlling. It's something passive in you, right? So your drive is, in this sense, you're not the actor. It is, but that makes you this passive thing. So that's what's going on. So here's I'm just going to use my actual own personal experience to talk about this, because I kind of want this to be made more concrete, because if we use an example of a serial killer, it's such an extreme thing. So I was faced with this personal kind of decision a few years ago where economic tragedy kind of struck, and I had to go, okay, do I give up philosophy? Do I give up my passion? Do I shift into like, I just have to like go about trying to make money and climb the ladder and do this. And what I was faced with was this distinction between morality and ethics of the drive. And it's like, okay, if I try to just do the normie life and work my way up and have a job and try to make more money each year and all of that, that's what society tells me is good. That's what society says is successful. But my whole life from that point on, I would feel so compromised. I would never be okay with myself if that's what I did. So I made the choice to maintain the fidelity. My jouissance is tied up with philosophy. It is. I have to do philosophy and theory in some way, shape, or form every single day. And if I'm not doing that, I'm not fucking okay. And so I had to make the choice. And that is this moment of where if I didn't choose this thing that's beyond my control, that I didn't actively choose, like I want philosophy to be the thing in life I need the most, right? No, right. It like chose me. But if I don't fight for it, I might as well head to the fucking bridge, because if I don't have this, I have nothing. And so, yeah, it would be great to have money and not struggle but I'm not fucking giving up philosophy. And I'd rather die than, in the biological sense, than give up my libidinal life in philosophy. And that's what the ethics of psychoanalysis is actually about.
That's so 100%. Perfect, because what was it I was going to say? No, that's 100% right. Because if you're not like it goes back to like, now this isn't as extreme as like the gallows instance.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing, because again, it's not that you didn't ask for that, but you felt as though like this is what you need to do, right? And so that's different from, it's not like a sort of calculated utilitarian logic, right? And so that's a perfect example of not compromising relative to your desire.
Think about it, like the pleasure principle would say, you're like struggling to pay your mortgage, struggling to get by, all of this economic, like just give it up and just do what's rational, do what's in your best interest, try to make more money, live a life of equilibrium where you have economic stability. And me and my drive goes, fuck you. No. And that is this self-destroy. I am destroying myself in a way by opting to remain faithful to my drive. But if I don't do that, I'm even worse in a way.
That's why 100%. That's why it's the forced unconscious choice, because this is Lacan's example of your money or your life, right? Totally. Well, if I give you the money, then you lose either way, right? Because if I give you your money,
life, if I have no money.
Yeah.
If I give up my life, I don't have my money.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a better example than I could have come up with,
and that's why I wanted to give it, because a lot of the times we're always given like examples that are kind of abstract, and I'm like, no, I've had to live this shit. Like, this is why I love Lacan and Zizek so much. This is why they're the center of my theoretical work, is they've given me more than the other. I love Heidegger still, and Kierkegaard and Marx and Baudrillard. I love all of them, and I've learned so much from Marshall McLuhan and Freud, and I mean, but for me and my circumstances and what I've been trying to work through, Lacan and Zizek are it. And that's why, like, I think, and especially it's from the clinic. This is people go in the clinic dealing with this kind of shit I'm dealing with. Theirs is different, but this is like the real concrete type of shit that where it matters. And like, so bringing the serial killer thing gets us thinking, like, as a thought experiment. But that's not really when Lacan's formulating the ethics of psychoanalysis, he's thinking about somebody in a situation like mine.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah.
Okay, since we have a pause, okay, this is just a random pivot, but I want to ask you, okay, because this is something that we've been talking about a lot. What are your thoughts on D&G and Anti-Oedipus and their critique of psychoanalysis? How do you feel about them?
I do think I haven't, to be honest, I haven't read any Guattari outside of Deleuze. I've read quite a bit of Deleuze. I very much like Kant's critical philosophy. I like difference in repetition. I like logic of sense.
Yep.
And I think Deleuze is brilliant, but I can't abide like Anti-Oedipus and Mill Plateau. I just because I mean, in a way, it's the simplest way, right, is lack and on the side of Lacan and surplus on the side of but the whole thing is that in Lacan, lack is it's always already surplus, right? There's and not that Deleuze isn't thinking dialectically, but for me the difference is, and so I mentioned this earlier. So I sometimes I like play philosopher on TV, but my training is in literary criticism and literary analysis. I'm in a literature department. Although I've broadened out more toward doing more straight theory, but I'm working on Melville, a book on Melville right now. I've been trying to finish it for a long time. It's just taking forever. But in Melville studies, especially with the materialist, ontological turn, there's all these different turns, and the objectal turn in academia, like you cannot go through Melville now without going through Deleuze, because it's just sort of everywhere. This sort of like Deleuzian, Spinozian focus on, and part of it has to do with what we were talking about earlier with the sort of the sort of ecological dimension of a lot of this thought. So Melville was just as interested in, ambient life, like plant life. He wasn't somebody who was placing, human being at the center of the universe and thinking anthropocentrically. And I think there's certainly elements of Melville's thought where you can see that. But for me, I've just always been far more interested in and far more convinced by the notion of, because I think that because I think the notion of subjectivity is so important. Like all the things that, like in Deleuze, like becoming whale and the body without organs and deterritorialization. I just think that Zizek's notion and I don't know if this is actually but
was that a joke? Does
what,
he actually? Is it becoming whale or?
Well, that's Melville.
No, but Deleuze uses becoming whale quite a bit. He's talking about, it's in 1,000 Plateaus. It's in a number of interviews. I'll send you. There's an essay where I have I traced all the different references to Melville, but becoming whale is Deleuze. But I just think the organ without a body is much more compelling to me than the body without an organ. I think like that's the way I would sort of sum it up, because I think that that matter, like for materialism, like of course you don't need this notion of a subject for, at least specifically for like a table, or like in the most like basic material sense. But what makes sort of matter come alive is, I think, like these sort of like anamorphoses that cause you to attribute something, to elevate things to the dignity of these positions. So like I just like when Deleuze is reading Kant and talking about repetition, difference, I think that he's on to something there. But I don't have a lot of patience for the Anti-Oedipus and the 1,000 Plateaus. But I do think Deleuze is brilliant. But I don't think that that Deleuze and Lacan, like some people would like to argue, are sort of commensurable. I think there's a vast difference there. But I don't know, Mikey. I'm actually interested in asking, like, what's your thought on Deleuze?
So for me, I'm very similar to your position. I think Difference in Repetition is easily one of the greatest works of philosophy of the 20th century.
Yeah.
I will always think of metaphysics and ontology through a Deleuzian lens, insofar as I think Deleuze did get something fundamentally right, which is throughout the history of philosophy, philosophers have always just thought in terms of the actual and the possible. So there's possibilities, but there's actual states of affairs. But the big problem when you use these categories is there seems to be like an ontological gap between them. How does the possible become the actual, right? And philosophers never really had a theory of this. And what Deleuze figured out is there's a third thing called intensity. And I always use these simple examples, but I think it takes a simple example of this to actually show how profound Deleuze was as a metaphysician, which is you take popping popcorn. Well, okay, you have a pack of popcorn kernels. Those are actual kernels. They have potentials in them. They can be turned into popcorn. But how do you get those potentials, which are there in them? How do you actualize them? How do you pull them out of potentiality or virtuality into actuality? You put them in an intensive field. So we get a microwave, we put the popcorn kernels in there, and that intensive field works on those actualities and brings out virtual potentials in them. And as simple as that is, you want to go, it took 2,000 years of philosophy for somebody to realize the role of intensity in the actualization of things. That that's just right. Like, he nailed that.
Yeah.
And so I think Difference in Repetition is it's still one of my favorite works of metaphysics. It is. I'm with Slavoj though. I think when he gets with Guattari and he starts doing the stuff, but I understand how their concept of desire, it's not just something arbitrary. Like what Deleuze had already done as a kind of Spinozist is the virtual, the intensive, and the actual are all positive. They're all positive. There's no negativity or contradiction here. What it is a kind of becoming process where there's selection and all of these things, but you don't get built-in antagonisms in this. So even though I fully embrace this idea of how intensity is transcendental, like it's operative in, you look around your room right now, and like if you're an Aristotelian, you just go, okay, I see substances, and you start describing them. Or if you're a Heideggerian, you think of them as referential totalities of tools, right? But what a Deleuzian would see is like, okay, I see all of these things with these various properties. If the temperature goes up 5,000 degrees, it all goes bye-bye. So the continuum, the range of intensity of the temperature makes these actualities what they are. It's a transcendental condition of them. I buy all of that. And so like I will always take this concept of intensity seriously as doing ontology. My thing is I'm also a Hegelian, Lacanian, so I think contradiction and built-in antagonism is also part of it. I haven't figured out what to do with the Deleuzian intensity thing, which I think is right, and then square that with Hegelian ontology. That's not something I've gone to work on yet, but I will say that I do think the concept of desire kind of does D&G's desiring production, this machinic connection thing. I think it's in line with their ontology, and that's why I always go out of my way to go, there's something fashionable in online philosophy circles of you just take a little bit of Zizek, a little bit of Deleuze, a little bit of Lacan, Baudrillard, Foucault, and you can sprinkle it all together. And I want to go, they have different ontologies. They're not the same. Like, yes, there are ways that something Foucault said can help you understand something Zizek says, of course. Yeah. But this it's stylish. Like it seems like it's really profound, but really I'll take anything from any of them, mix it all together like it's consistent, and it's not. So I'm all for working through these connections in a really theoretically robust way, but I'm also against these quick and easy, free associative connections between all these thinkers when there are real meaningful differences between their theoretical frameworks. But
Could I just want to, I mean, I don't know how much I can get you to speak to it right now, but you are working on a post right now, which is basically a book that is basically about this, but you go a lot further actually concerning Deleuze. And I'm just wondering, like, maybe say something about it, because the time people are watching this in the future, like 6 months from now, your article will be on your blog.
I'll just say I am working on it's like over 60,000 words now. It is a kind of free flow cascading series of connections, right? It doesn't have a thesis. I'm writing this thing for you, Dave, and then also for Andrew and Nick now. Like, it's just a bunch of stuff about Lacanian Žižekian theory that I've wanted to say to them for a long time now, and I'm going to do it. But it's kind of made up of 3 parts. The first part is Marxism and psychoanalysis, like the whole thing that we get with Lacan and Zizek and Marx and that stuff. Then it pivots into my critique of Deleuze and Guattari from Žižekian Lacanian perspective, Hegelian perspective, and then a whole thing on the superego. But yeah, I mean, I'm trying. This is my way of trying to work through this stuff. And look, despite my deep appreciation for Deleuze's metaphysics, I just don't agree with him and Guattari on desire at all. I think they get it wrong.
Yeah, because one thing they say about desire and desiring production, right, is that, like, even though there's a code of, I guess, Oedipus capitalism that territorialize desiring and production, that it's still a positive thing. And since they're anti-Hegelian, right, they go for this, like, as you said, Spinoza take, but also Nietzsche with his will to power. And it's like the same thing for Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche is anti-Hegelian. And so he sees, like, will to power as constantly discharging strength and becoming. And so even something like slave morality, even though he's very critical about it, he still sees it as a positive becoming for will to power to express itself. In the same way we could see Deleuze's desiring production as expressing itself even in a coded form like capitalism. So, like, in the end, it's just kind of assemble on a positively becoming, but never have this radical negativity to escape that flow. You could say, oh, that's deterritorialization, but it, like, again, he doesn't have this understanding of dialectical contradiction because he doesn't have an understanding of, or he refuses to see mediation as a thing, and because he thinks that's a false movement.
So, of course, my analysis of this is it's really long, but I mean, one thing that goes along with what you just said is here's a difference, right? D&G think enjoyment is in the actual connection to the thing, right? We think it's in not getting it. It's circling the object, right? It's missing it. As Todd puts it, it's enjoying what we don't have. And so I'm sorry, they're not the same. Like, desiring production is about these machinic connections, and the enjoyment is in actually getting the thing or connecting to the thing. For us, it's in not getting the thing. It's just these are 2 different concepts of enjoyment.
Yeah, well, this is also why, I mean, if you think about Lacan, it's where it's what place an object or a thing occupies in a certain grid is like the wrong term, but this is why things can be sublimated, desublimated, resublimated, because it's not the enjoyment lies not in the thing. The enjoyment, like you were saying, it lies in not getting it and realizing, oh, that this isn't it, because again, drive is just using desire as a lure. So it's not as though there's one, sublime object that somebody will pursue. Multiple things can come to inhabit that space. And it's making me think of Lacan's seminar on the Purloined Letter, where he basically talks about, he's not interested in these characters as such, but the way in which throughout the tale, if you have 3 different positions, they come to occupy different positions in different spaces of it. So which is very different from, like you were saying, a Deleuzian understanding of what constitutes desire.
Well, and they think if we get rid of the no, right, the real good enjoyment is not having the no, where for us, sorry, it's the no that makes it possible for us to enjoy. It's the obstacle, the limit. And so
right.
my thing is, part of it is, I think DNG, I think desiring production is the concept of desiring production is DNG's own unconscious fantasy of how they wish desire was. I don't think there's anything that actually corresponds to desiring production or the machinic unconscious. I think they made it up.
There's also the misreading of Hegel in there too that I think we can address, which is exactly what you'll be discussing with For They Know Not What They Do, with Zizek's taking a part of Derrida's criticism of Hegel, in that like this thought that with Aufhebung, with sublation, everything is sublated in the ultimate identity of the absolute idea, which is not what Hegel is getting at. But it seems like DNG, the way they eschew dialectics, like presupposes that idea of the ultimate identity of everything in Hegel, which is not what he's saying.
Right. No, and I mean, it's this whole reckoning with the antagonism. It's this reckoning with how your identity is, how it differs or is not fully itself, right? And all of this is at play. This idea that what Hegel's doing is building out this one. I mean, we're going to get it in the first, or is it the second chapter of For They Know Not What They Do, where Slavoj is going to address Hegel's monism, and that's really what this charge that a lot of them have against Hegel is like, oh, there's one ultimate identity. Kierkegaard did this. Like, as much as I love Kierkegaard, it's like the individual is negated within the whole, and like, so the whole ultimately, yes, there's these moments of what seem to be apparent differences between things, but ultimately absolute knowing or the absolute idea would be this moment where no, all is one, right? All things are reconciled. That is not at all what it is. And so, yeah, as we move through the course, that's what we'll be talking about. But yeah, my thing is, I don't think that the type of desire they think is there. I think actually existing desire, which they would just call psychoanalytic desire or neurotic desire or Oedipalized desire. I honestly think that's actually existing desire is the only desire we have. I don't think this other thing they think that is repressed or hidden beneath our actually existing desire is actually there. I think that it's a fantasy.
Right. No, that's true. And then like, because they're in the psychotics discourse and like schizopsychotic, like they think that, they could get rid of the no. And as you said, certain about enjoyment by culling onto machines. But if we look at the framework in which we talk about desire with lack and objet a, they don't take into account that if there is a possibility to actually achieve the object cause of desire, that leads to melancholia, right? Mourning to melancholia, the loss of enjoyment because you actually came in encounter with the real thing, and therefore you can't desire anymore. And like that becomes a problem in the collective sense, right? With people trying to cling to nostalgic ways of fantasizing because they have no enjoyment. They can't hope for things. It's almost kind of similar to maybe Mark Fisher's capitalist realism of you could imagine the end of the world, but not like the destruction of capitalism. And there's a resort to going back to a phantasmatic way of how things used to be because you can't enjoy anymore.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Wrap it up here. I gotta go.
Sure.
This is. I mean, I've got to go in a little bit too, but this. I mean, honestly, I could do this for.
Yeah.
If I didn't have to go, I could do this forever.
I wanted to talk to you for so long, Russ.
Wait, so you guys recorded a conversation together that was never released, right?
No, I've done a bunch of those with Todd. Russ and I we've been talking about having a conversation for a long time.
We'll do one now. We'll talk. Actually, I was thinking the last thing with what Mikey was saying was, I mean, you can encapsulate that pretty much in the saying from the line from the preface to the phenomenology, right? Not only is substance, but also as subject, because
Mhm.
and this is another, I mean, this would be another misunderstanding, or lends itself to misunderstanding. Like Hegel's point there is like subject, it's another like it's another like meaning of it. Subject there is just another term for contradiction, right? Because it's that it's substance's inability, or it's substance's inability to be substantive, to be itself, to be identical with itself. This is the whole point about Hegel's reading of Christ, right? This is why the Christian religion is wait, I'm going back to now the is it the aesthetics? But anyway, the notion that God himself, I mean, it's if there's a big other, if ever there's a big other, that the big other doesn't exist, that God himself is split, right, in the figure of Christ. And so subject there is not some sort of, again, like actant, but is just another, we were talking about, different names for the same phenomena, at the beginning. But subject there just means like the rift within substance. It's inability to actually be, substantial.
So I just to follow up on that. So Deleuze has this famous line. It's in both Difference and Repetition, and they repeat it in Anti-Oedipus, and I also think in A Thousand Plateaus. I think it's in all three of them, where they say something akin to the world is an egg. And the idea is that the world is an egg insofar as it's actual, it's virtual, it's intensive, and that it is this wellspring of positive potentials and actualizations. And so for us, like, okay, for D&G, the world is an egg. Well, for us, sure, the world is an egg, so long as it's a cracked egg.
Yeah.
And honestly, that is the ontological difference in our positions here, is that, no, I mean, the egg itself is fractured, it's cracked, and so it's not purely positive, it's mediated. The egg is the egg that it is precisely because it's cracked.
Got to break a few eggs to make.
Yeah, wasn't that the Lacan? Doesn't Lacan have that pun on man, like omelet?
Omelet,
yeah.
Maybe I need to add that in because I'm doing this thing. So
yeah,
that would be,
I gotta find that.
That's good. That's true. Yeah.
Good basis for some memes. Yeah.
Yes.
All right, guys. Well, it's been a total pleasure. It's really nice
awesome.
that we got to, it's been a while, since we actually met. Like that was back in 2018, I think. And so it's been nice to catch up, and thank you for doing this with us.
This is so much fun.
Thanks, it was nice. Yeah, it was nice to meet you.
Yeah,
and
likewise.
Open invitation to come on whenever.
Yeah.
Keep the chat going.
Oh, I'll come back on. Yeah, this was. I mean, especially now that there's no football on, so I need something to do on Sundays.
Yeah.
Let's keep it going.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks, guys.
All right, y'all.
thanks. Talk to you later.
Peace.
Much love. Bye-bye.